October 29th, 2018, 6:20 in the morning. Jakarta's Soekarno-Hatta International Airport hadn't fully woken up yet. On the runway sat a Boeing 737 MAX 8. It had rolled off the factory floor just 11 weeks earlier. Brand new, gleaming. Inside sat 189 people, some heading to the office, some flying home to family.
None of them knew that the next 13 minutes would be the last 13 minutes of their lives. The plane took off, and then something strange happened. The nose kept pitching down. The pilots kept pulling it back up, but some invisible force kept shoving it back down, again and again. Inside the cockpit, there was confusion. There was panic. And then, over the Java Sea, the plane went straight into the water.
All 189 people on board were killed. The world called it an accident. It wasn't. It was the opening chapter of a story in which an American company put profit ahead of human life. The story begins in 2011. Boeing had spent decades as one of the two dominant aircraft manufacturers on Earth, but now it faced a threat. Its European rival, Airbus, had just launched a new plane, the A320neo.
It used newer, more fuel-efficient engines than anything Boeing was offering. Airlines loved it. Orders started pouring in. Boeing had two options: design an entirely new aircraft from scratch, a process that could take a decade, or take its existing workhorse, the 737, and bolt bigger engines onto it. Boeing chose the fast option. They called it the 737 MAX. That decision didn't come out of nowhere.
Its roots stretched back further. In 1997, Boeing merged with another aerospace company, McDonnell Douglas. Veteran engineers say that's when the culture began to shift. Boeing had once been known as an engineers' company. Decisions were made by technical experts. But after the merger, the company even moved its headquarters from Seattle to Chicago, away from the engineering floor and closer to Wall Street.
Many longtime employees later said every decision started getting weighed on a single scale, how much value it delivered to shareholders. That was the environment the 737 MAX was born into. But here's where the real trouble started. The new, larger engines didn't fit under the old 737's low-slung wings. Engineers had to mount them further forward and higher up. That shifted the plane's aerodynamic balance.
During flight, especially when the nose pitched up, the aircraft now had a tendency to pitch up even further on its own. That was dangerous. It raised the risk of an aerodynamic stall. Boeing's engineers came up with a fix, a piece of software. They called it MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System.
Its job was simple. If a sensor detected the nose climbing too steeply, the system would automatically push the nose back down. On paper, it sounds like a safety feature. But buried inside that system was a flaw that would go on to kill 346 people. Tension Peak relied on a single sensor. One sensor, called an angle of attack sensor.
If that one sensor failed or fed the system bad data, MCAS would believe the plane was in danger. And it would push the nose down hard again and again, even if the aircraft was flying perfectly fine. There was no second sensor to cross-check it, no backup. That single point of failure would prove fatal. Now the question was how Boeing would get this system approved by America's aviation regulator, the FAA.
And here another major decision was made. Boeing chose not to fully disclose MCAS to pilots. The company's reasoning: if pilots needed extensive new training or simulator sessions, it would cost airlines time and money. And for Boeing, that mattered enormously.
The company had made a promise to one of its biggest customers, Southwest Airlines. If pilots ended up needing additional simulator training, Boeing would owe them a massive financial penalty. In other words, the math of profit overruled the math of safety. Internal messages that surfaced later showed Boeing's own employees were uneasy about this.
One of the company's flight technical pilots, a man named Mark Faulkner, wrote to a colleague that he had, in his own words, Jedi mind-tricked regulators into approving MCAS. In that same exchange, he admitted he had unknowingly lied about the system. That message wouldn't surface until a year later in a federal investigation. By then, it was far too late. Years afterward, Faulkner stood trial on fraud charges.
Props. A jury acquitted him. His lawyers argued he couldn't be the lone scapegoat when an entire corporate system stood behind that decision. Around the same time, another critical detail got buried. In early design documents, MCAS's authority, how aggressively it could push the nose down, was relatively limited.
But during flight testing, engineers discovered that under certain conditions, the plane could still slip out of control. So, in a later stage of development, MCAS's authority was increased several times over. That change was never fully reflected in the safety documentation submitted to the FAA.
The system that got approved on paper was not nearly as powerful as the one that ended up flying on real airplanes full of passengers. By September 2017, the first 737 MAX was delivered to airlines. Carriers around the world started buying it. It became the fastest-selling aircraft in Boeing's history. Thousands of orders poured in. On Wall Street, the company's stock price kept climbing.
And then came that morning, October 29th, 2008, when Lion Air Flight 610 went down in the Java Sea. Investigators recovered the black box. It showed that in the plane's final minutes, the pilots had been fighting an invisible force the entire time. MCAS kept firing over and over. The pilots kept trying to correct it, but they had no idea this system even existed. They'd never been trained on it.
It wasn't even mentioned in the flight manual. What was Boeing's response? Publicly, the company pointed toward pilot error. The implication was that if the crew had followed the correct procedure, the crash could have been avoided. Boeing's CEO reassured the public that the aircraft was safe. Airlines around the world kept flying it. Just days after the Lion Air crash, Boeing issued a technical bulletin.
It told airlines that if a sensor malfunctioned and the nose kept pitching down, pilots could flip certain switches to disable the system. But even that bulletin never fully named MCAS. Thousands of pilots flying this aircraft every single day still didn't have the complete picture. A major U.S. pilots union pushed Boeing directly. Is there something else we haven't been told?
The company kept insisting the plane was fully safe. Then came the morning of March 10th, 2019. Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 took off. This aircraft was also a 737 MAX 8. Within 6 minutes, in almost the exact same pattern, the nose began pitching down again and again.
The crew, Captain Yard Getachew and First Officer Ahmed Nur Mohammad, had over 8,000 flight hours of combined experience. They had read the emergency guidance issued after the Lion Air crash. They followed the correct emergency procedure. They even disabled the system by the book. It didn't matter.
By the time they intervened, the aircraft was already flying too fast at too extreme an angle to recover by manual control alone. Within 6 minutes, it was over. All 157 people on board were killed, citizens of 35 countries, including a group of United Nations staff on their way to an environmental conference in Nairobi. Families, children. Now the world had run out of excuses.
2 nearly identical crashes, 5 months apart, involving the same brand new aircraft model. This wasn't coincidence. China was the first to ground the plane in its airspace. Then Europe followed, then Indonesia, Australia, Singapore. One by one, nearly the entire world. The United States, Boeing's own home turf, hesitated at first. The FAA insisted it didn't yet have solid technical grounds to ground the aircraft.
Public pressure kept building. Pilot unions spoke out openly. Finally, 3 days later, America had to fall in line. The sitting president personally announced
that the aircraft would be grounded in U.S. airspace too. The entire global fleet of 737 MAX planes was now sitting parked. Boeing's best-selling aircraft, the one its future depended on, had become a grounded warning sign at every airport on Earth.
The financial fallout wasn't limited to human lives. It hit Boeing's balance sheet hard too. Within a year of the grounding, the company had absorbed billions of dollars in losses. New aircraft deliveries stopped. Airlines started demanding compensation. For the first time in decades, Boeing was forced into major layoffs. A reputation once treated as the gold standard of American engineering was now under global scrutiny.
Now the real investigation began. The U.S. House Transportation Committee spent 18 months digging through the wreckage. Not of the planes, but of the paper trail. Thousands of documents. Internal emails, text messages, engineering reports. What surfaced was damning. Boeing's own employees had raised alarms internally.
One engineer messaged a colleague that the plane seemed designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys. That language sounds harsh out of context, but it captures the internal unease that never made it seriously up the chain to leadership. The investigation also revealed that the FAA had delegated a large chunk of the certification process directly to Boeing's own engineers. It was called the Organization Designation Authorization Program. Under it, Boeing engineers, technically acting on the FAA's behalf, were largely certifying their own company's designs as safe. The very company whose plane needed independent scrutiny was, to a significant degree, grading its own homework. This arrangement had existed in U.S. aviation for decades, meant to save time and cost. The congressional report stated plainly that the FAA simply didn't have the resources to independently verify every technical detail. As a result, a system as consequential as MCAS never got the level of senior-level scrutiny it needed. The report summed up the failure in blunt terms. This was a horrific culmination of engineering choices and regulatory failures, with both the company and the regulator sharing the blame.
The committee also found that several Boeing engineers had proposed designing MCAS to rely on 2 sensors instead of 1, so that if one failed, the other could catch the error. That proposal never moved forward at the time. It would have meant redesigning the system, adding delay, and possibly triggering the very pilot training requirements Boeing was trying to avoid.
That single overlooked engineering safeguard is the decision that, in hindsight, sent 2 aircraft out of the sky. Tenjin Peak, the grief of the victims' families, doesn't fit into statistics. Many testified before Congress. They sat in hearing rooms holding photographs of their children, their spouses. One father, whose daughter had been aboard the Ethiopian Airlines flight, showed up to every single hearing.
He'd place her photograph on the table in front of him, so every official, every witness in that room had to look at the face behind the investigation. Over and over, families asked the same question: did Boeing know? The answer, based on the documents, was yes. Internal concerns about MCAS existed well before the first crash ever happened. In October 2019, Boeing's then CEO was summoned to testify before Congress himself.
Over 2 days of hearings, lawmakers pressed him with pointed questions, with grieving family members seated in the room. Senators asked whether the company had ever considered grounding the plane after the first crash. The answers weren't satisfying. A few months later, in December 2019, he was removed from his position, a rare and significant move in Boeing's history. In January 2021, the U.S.
Department of Justice reached a settlement with Boeing, a deferred prosecution agreement. Under the deal, Boeing was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, but the company avoided a formal criminal trial. In exchange, Boeing agreed to pay roughly $2.5 billion, fines, compensation to airlines, and a fund for victims' families.
The agreement stated clearly that 2 Boeing employees had withheld critical MCAS-related information from FAA certification officials. But even this document never named a single senior executive. Many families called the settlement inadequate. Their argument: no individual executive was held personally accountable, no one went to prison, no full criminal trial ever took place.
Some families formally challenged the agreement in federal court. A federal judge later remarked that the Justice Department had failed its own legal obligations by excluding victims' families from the negotiation process entirely. This fight continued in U.S. courts for years afterward, with families continuing to push for a full criminal trial against the company and its executives.
After 20 months grounded, in November 2020, U.S. regulators cleared the 737 MAX to fly again. MCAS was redesigned to rely on 2 sensors instead of 1. If the 2 readings didn't match, the system wouldn't activate at all. Its authority was also limited, so pilots could override it under any circumstance. Pilot training was overhauled. MCAS was now taught in detail.
Gradually, once individual regulators around the world signed off, airlines started putting the aircraft back into service. Notably, European and Canadian regulators insisted on running their own independent reviews, rather than simply trusting the FAA's approval. A clear sign that the world was no longer willing to take America's aviation authority at its word. But the story doesn't end there.
On January 2024, an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 lost a door plug, a panel covering an unused emergency exit, in midair, just minutes after takeoff. A gaping hole tore open in the fuselage. Wind ripped through the cabin. Phones and belongings were sucked out into the sky. Fortunately, the plane hadn't yet reached cruising altitude, and the pilots managed an emergency landing. No one died.
But the investigation found that 4 critical bolts securing that panel had never been installed at the factory. The aircraft had been handed over for service without being properly inspected. The incident reignited every question about Boeing's manufacturing quality and safety culture. U.S. regulators capped the company's production rate. An independent review panel concluded there was a deep breakdown of trust between Boeing and its own workforce, and that employees who raised safety concerns were routinely ignored. It was a clear signal that the lessons of the 737 MAX crisis had never been fully absorbed. Another Boeing CEO stepped down in the aftermath. Throughout this story, one more name keeps surfacing.
John Barnett, who spent years as a quality manager at Boeing's South Carolina factory. Even after retiring, he kept publicly alleging that production pressure at the plant was so intense that safety inspections were being deliberately shortchanged. He gave formal testimony to federal agencies. In March 2024, while in the middle of giving a deposition in his ongoing lawsuit against Boeing, he was found dead in his car.
Investigators ruled it a suicide, but the news raised uncomfortable questions around the world. Can telling the truth inside a company like this cost that much? That question remains unanswered, and the case is still active in U.S. courts and headlines today. Tenjin Peak, today, years later. This case is taught in engineering ethics and corporate governance courses around the world.
It's a warning about what happens when a company, racing to win a market battle, pushes safety down its list of priorities. A software flaw, an undisclosed decision, internal pressure that never made it up the chain. Together, they took 346 lives. None of those passengers boarded those planes knowing they were about to become part of a corporate decision. This isn't just a story about an airplane.
It's a good story about how trust works in the modern world. We take our seats, buckle in, and assume that the engineers, the company, and the regulator who approved this machine put our lives first. We assume the agency responsible for our safety did its job independently and without compromise. The story of the 737 MAX shakes that assumption to its core. 346 people. Each one had a name, a family.
Plans that never got finished. Someone heading to Nairobi to work on environmental policy. Someone flying home. Someone on their first trip abroad. These aren't statistics.
They were human lives lost to a corporate decision they had no part in making.
This case is a reminder that behind even the most impressive balance sheet, if safety gets pushed aside, it's always ordinary people. People who had no say in that decision, who end up paying the highest price. The story of the 737 MAX is a reminder that trust like this always deserves scrutiny, always deserves hard questions.
Because when profit and safety are forced into competition, history shows us the right choice doesn't always win. If this story hit you the way it hit us, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe. We'll keep bringing you more true, document-based stories just like this one.